Winter. A mountain plateau blasted by wind. 6 silhouettes on skis slip across the snow, breath turning to silver in the dark. Below them, a fortress of light and concrete hums over a frozen valley. Inside, barrels and tanks feed a process with an innocent name and a terrifying purpose. If they fail tonight, the war could tilt in a direction no one can afford. If they succeed, a door toward Hitler's bomb slams shut. This is the story of the raid that almost no one heard, because it was executed so cleanly, so quietly, that the world learned about it only after the war. To understand why a handful of Norwegians risked everything to break into a factory, you need to know one phrase: heavy water. Regular water is hydrogen and oxygen. Heavy water is almost the same, except the hydrogen atoms are a bit heavier. That tiny difference makes it incredibly useful in a nuclear reactor. In the early 1940s, if you wanted to turn natural uranium into a path toward plutonium for a bomb, heavy water could help you do it. And the best place on Earth to make heavy water in quantity sat on a ledge above a waterfall in Telemark, Norway, Vemork. Norway was under German occupation. The Vemork plant, built by Norsk Hydro, produced heavy water as a byproduct of hydrogen production. The Allies feared that if Germany stockpiled enough of it, the Third Reich could overcome key bottlenecks in its atomic program. The challenge? Vemork was perched above a deep gorge, guarded, floodlit, and surrounded by steep cliffs and winter ice. A conventional assault would be suicide. Bombing it from the air risked missing a small target, killing civilians, and hardening German resolve. The answer had to be a scalpel, not a hammer. The first scalpel broke. In November 1942, the British launched a daring but doomed glider operation called Freshman. 2 gliders, towed across the North Sea in brutal weather, never made it intact. Crashes and captures followed. Survivors fell into German hands, and under Hitler's commando order, many were executed. The Germans increased security around Vemork. Floodlights, guards, patrols. The message was clear: try again, and we will be ready. The cost of failure had become unbearable, but so had the cost of leaving the plant untouched. Across the plateau above Vemork, a different story was unfolding. A 4-man Norwegian team had parachuted in earlier, Operation Grouse. They were young, hungry, and stubborn. They skied across the Hardangervidda, hunted reindeer to survive, and transmitted whispers back to Britain. Their names mattered then, and they matter now. Jens Anton Poulsen, Arne Kjellstrup, Knut Haugland, and Claes Hellberg. While freshmen fell from the sky, these 4 stayed invisible in the snow, waiting for a second chance that might never come. It did. The second chance came with 6 more Norwegians trained by the British Special Operations Executive, Joachim Rønneberg, just 23 and in command, Knut Haukelid, Fredrik Kaiser, Kasper Idland, Hans Storhaug, and Birger Strømsheim. They jumped in February 1943 into a landscape of ice and wind. Parachutes bloomed against the white, containers thumped into drifts, the team lashed their gear to sleds and skied toward a radio signal and a cookfire they prayed was friendly. When the 2 teams finally met, frostbitten hands gripped and grinned. The operation had a new name now: Gunnerside. The plan they built was elegant because complexity would kill. There were several possible approaches to the plant. The suspension bridge over the gorge was the obvious route, and therefore the worst. The front gate was guarded and watched. The river below was half frozen and treacherous. But there was a cable tunnel, a narrow access route cut into the rock, and a door that led into the belly of the hydrogen plant. It would be locked, but locks fail to logic and patience. If they could descend the ravine, find that door, and move like ghosts, they might reach the electrolysis room where heavy water was concentrated. A few pounds of explosives in the right place could do what hundreds of bombs might not. On the night of February 27th, the commandos split into teams. A cover party fanned out to watch bridges and paths. The demolition team shouldered satchels of plastic explosive, pencil fuses, pliers, and sheer nerve. They eased into the ravine, crampons scratching rock, snow silently pouring off ledges. The river glowed black under a skin of ice. Above, lights swept like slow moons across the cliff. A misstep would send steel helmets clattering and the alarm shrieking. There were thousands of German soldiers within reach. There would be no firefight, only capture or death. They reached the cable tunnel and the locked door. A bolt cutter whispered. A pry bar breathed. Metal yielded. Inside, warmth, humming machinery, the scent of oil and electrolyte. The men moved with the kind of calm that only comes from fear mastered by practice. They knew the layout from memory and rehearsals. The electrolysis cells stood in rows, great metal tanks that separated heavy water from ordinary water. The explosives would have to be placed tight to the critical parts, charges small enough to be surgical, timers precise enough to allow an escape, but not so long that a patrolling guard would wander in and undo their work. A caretaker appeared at the worst possible moment. Imagine the collective heartbeat in that room. A civilian, suddenly confronted with strangers in British-style uniforms, faces smeared, tools in hand. The commando spoke quietly. No one raised a weapon. The caretaker understood, or at least he understood enough not to shout. Later, the saboteurs would do something humane and completely astonishing. Before they lit the fuses, they made sure he had his glasses, because in wartime, you cannot simply replace spectacles. Then they returned to their work, used pencil detonators they had calibrated for minutes, not seconds, and set the timers running. They left a few clues on purpose. A Thompson submachine gun, for example, British manufacture. The idea was to mislead German investigators into thinking this was an outside job by British troops, not an inside job by local workers. Reprisals had already drenched Norway in grief. Anything that deflected German anger away from local civilians was worth the gamble. With the fuses burning down, the commandos melted back through the corridors, retraced their steps to the cable tunnel, and slid, climbed, scrambled back into the winter night. The blast was not cinematic. There was no apocalyptic fireball, no towering plume. It was a series of brutal, contained punches. Metal shattered, pipes tore, electrolysis cells buckled and split. Inside the plant, alarms finally screamed. Outside, the saboteurs were already moving, separating into escape groups. Some would ski more than 300 kilometers across enemy-occupied terrain toward neutral Sweden. Some would vanish into safe houses and resistance circles closer to home. Patrols fanned out, roadblocks went up, and angry men with dogs and guns swept a frozen plateau in the dark. They caught no one. Morning revealed the scale of the damage. Heavy water stocks were gone or contaminated. The critical equipment was wrecked. The production line was broken. For months, the German program lost one of its few reliable sources of heavy water. And perhaps even more important than the physical damage was the shock to confidence. The Germans had underestimated what a small, disciplined team could do inside a well-defended industrial site. Now they knew. Of course, the war did not stop for damaged machines. The occupying authorities repaired Vemork and tried to restart the process. The Allies responded with the big hammer they had hoped to avoid. In November 1943, American bombers roared over the valley and rained hundreds of bombs on the complex and surrounding facilities. Bombing in daylight improved accuracy, but even then, many bombs missed. Civilians died. It was a grim lesson about industrial targets in mountainous terrain. Even the mightiest air raid might not sever the right artery. Berlin looked for a way to salvage what remained. If heavy water could not be made safely at Vemork, it could be moved. In early 1944, the Germans prepared to ship barrels by rail and ferry across Lake Tinnsjø and onward to Germany. If those barrels reached their destination, months of sabotage and bombing would be blunted. The resistance faced a terrible choice: allow the cargo through, or attack a civilian ferry carrying workers and families alongside German soldiers. They chose to act as carefully as they could. Norwegian saboteurs placed charges on the railway ferry SF Hydro. The explosives were set to explode at the deepest part of the lake to minimize the chance of salvage, but as close to shore as possible to maximize survival odds for passengers. On February 20th, 1944, the charges detonated. The ship heeled, the lake rushed in, and the ferry went down to a depth of over 400 meters. Many were saved by locals who rowed into the winter water to pull survivors from the surface. 18 people died, among them Norwegian civilians and German soldiers. The burden of that decision never left the men who made it. It was the resistance at its most effective and its most heartbreaking. Did these operations stop Hitler's bomb? The honest answer is that the German atomic effort suffered from more than one wound. Infighting among scientists and officials slowed decisions. Scarcity dogged the supply chain. Technical choices like relying on pure heavy water or not took time to sort out. But it is equally honest to say this: the raids in Telemark removed a critical resource at a critical time. They deprived the German program of confidence and continuity. They forced choices and delays that pushed the bomb further out of reach as the war's tide turned. When you are racing a clock, months matter. The men on skis bought those months. Think about the people behind the codenames. Joachim Rønneberg, barely out of his teens, making decisions that seasoned officers might have flinched from. Knut Haukelid, who would later take the fight to the ferry. Frederick Kaiser and Kasper Idland, cool inside a humming plant with guards only steps away. Hans Storhaug and Birger Strömsheim, steady hands under pressure. And the Grouse team, Poulsen, Kjellstrup, Haugland, Hellberg, who survived on a frozen plateau long enough to make any second wave possible. They were not superheroes. They were trained, prepared, and determined men who understood their home terrain and were ready to do an impossible job without applause. There is another layer to the legacy. The raid influenced how special operations are conceived even today. Small teams, precise targets, deep local knowledge, and the discipline to leave without a trace. This template echoes from post-war commando units to modern special forces. It also left something for civilians. A museum at Vemork where visitors can walk the bridge, look down into the gorge, and try to imagine the courage it took to climb into that darkness. Art and film tried to capture the story, some versions flashy and loose with the facts, others quieter and closer to what actually happened. The real thing remains more compelling than any movie. A single night when patience, skill, and restraint carried the day. There's a poignant epilogue under the lake. Decades after the ferry went down, divers found barrels on the bottom and tested what was inside. The results showed that the shipment held heavy water, but not in concentrations that could have built a bomb by itself. The German program was farther from a working weapon than the worst Allied fears assumed. Even so, think about the alternative history if the plant had run uninterrupted, if shipments had flowed, if confidence had grown. The Telemark operations closed off that alternate path. History is not only what happens, it's also what doesn't. The saboteurs refused to be celebrated as giants. When asked, they said they just did their duty. They credited the farmers who hid them, the families who passed notes, the radio operators who risked the knock on the door in the middle of the night. They returned to ordinary lives in a Norway that had to rebuild. Some lived long and saw how the world changed. When they spoke about that winter, they spoke more about teamwork than heroics, more about silence than gunfire. They had gone into a fortress with the goal of leaving one room full of broken metal, and they had done it. If you step back and look at the arc of the war, you will see the grand battles that defined continents. You will see factories and fleets and armies of millions. What happened at Vemork was not a grand battle. It was a hinge, a small, nearly invisible hinge on which global events pivoted a few degrees. Degrees matter. Degrees decide whether a project crosses a threshold in time, whether a government chooses one path over another, whether a war ends with or without a new kind of terror unleashed. On a winter night in 1943, 6 men moved the hinge. If this story gripped you, help it reach more people. Like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for deep dives into the moments where small decisions change the world. And if you want more from this series, watch our next episode on the hidden battles fought in the Arctic between Norway and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Your support keeps these stories alive.